So, when you hear the word halal, what comes to mind? For most of us, it's probably a food label, right? But what if I told you that behind that simple label is this massive, sprawling, and super complex global system? Turns out what halal really means today is way more intricate and honestly more challenging than you'd ever guess. So let's just dive right in with a big question. What does halal actually mean? I mean, this is a word that guides the daily choices of almost 2 billion people. So what does it look like in our modern globalized world? Most people think it's pretty simple. Oh, halal? That's just no pork, no alcohol. Easy. But the reality? Whoa, it's this incredibly complicated web of microscopic science, tangled international trade deals, and really deep cultural practices. It's a huge leap from just a simple rule to a massive global industry. And believe me, that's where things start to get really tricky. Okay, so let's peel back the first layer of this onion, ingredients. The thing is, it's usually not about what you can see. The real challenge, the biggest headache for halal compliance, comes from the tiny, microscopic stuff hidden deep inside the products we use every single day. Let's take a perfect example, gelatin. I mean, think about gummy bears, marshmallows, even some yogurts, right? That stuff that makes them bouncy and thick, well, it's a super common thickener, and a lot of the time, it's made from pigs. So for a halal consumer, figuring out where that gelatin came from, well, it's not just a nice to know. It is absolutely essential. And this is where the massive supply chain headache kicks in. Imagine, a single non-halal ingredient, like that gelatin from a pig, gets into the system way at the beginning. It goes through processing plants, becomes an additive, and by the time you see that final product on the supermarket shelf, its true origin is totally invisible. So you can see why being able to trace every single step is just non-negotiable. And look, they're not just talking about candy here. Not by a long shot. This whole problem of hidden, tricky ingredients, it shows up in some of the most surprising places you can imagine. Yeah, check this out. You've got processed meats, where non-halal meat like pork can get mixed in. There's yogurt and cheese, which might use that gelatin we talked about, or other enzymes. And get this, even something super healthy sounding like kombucha is a challenge. Why? Because the fermentation process naturally creates alcohol. The big takeaway here is that products that seem totally fine on the surface actually need a whole lot of investigation. Okay, so if just finding these hidden ingredients is tough, trying to prove that a product is actually halal, that's a whole other level of difficulty. And this brings us to our next big hurdle, what I like to call the global certification maze. So here's a question that really gets to the core of the problem, especially for global trade. Let's say a product gets the official halal stamp of approval in one country. Does that mean it's considered halal everywhere else? You'd think so, right? But the answer, amazingly, is very often no. I mean, just look at Indonesia and Malaysia, two of the biggest Muslim majority countries in the world. In Indonesia, a halal certificate is good for 4 years. In Malaysia, only 2. They even have different specific rules for how animals are supposed to be slaughtered. When you don't have a single, universal standard, it creates these huge roadblocks for any business trying to sell their products internationally. And you have to ask, who gets hit the hardest by this messy patchwork system? Well, it's almost always the little guys, the small and medium-sized businesses. The very companies that are supposed to be the backbone of the economy. For them, trying to figure all this out, it can feel downright impossible. And here's exactly why. The hurdles are just huge. First, the cost to get certified can be way too expensive. Then you've got the paperwork, which is just a nightmare of complexity. And on top of all that, there's often just not enough information or support to help them. The end result? So many of these smaller producers are basically locked out of this gigantic global market. All right, so up until now, we've pretty much been talking about food. But this is where the story takes a really interesting turn. The whole idea of halal is now stretching way beyond the dinner plate and into totally new areas, which, as you can guess, brings up a whole new can of worms. Yep, the halal challenge is now popping up in some really unexpected places. Like in your medicine cabinet. Seriously, we're talking about everything from concerns about pig-derived ingredients in certain vaccines to the fact that alcohol is often used to make common liquid medicines. Healthcare is becoming a huge new frontier for all this. And then there's your closet. There's this whole movement around halal fashion, and it's not just about covering up. It's about making sure the entire process, from the materials to the manufacturing, is ethical and sustainable, which lines up with bigger Islamic ideas about how we should treat the world. Thinking about a vacation, the halal tourism industry is absolutely booming, but it's running into problems. Like, how do you create a single standard for hotels? How do you give travelers reliable info so they can find things like prayer rooms or guaranteed halal food? It's a tough nut to crack. And believe it or not, it's even in your bank account. Islamic finance is a massive field that works on a totally different set of rules, like no earning interest and no investing in industries like alcohol or gambling. It's basically created this whole separate financial world. So, when you put all of this together, what do you get? You get a global industry that has unbelievable potential, but at the same time, it's kind of struggling, weighed down by its own complicated nature. Indonesia is the perfect example of this. I mean, it's home to the world's biggest Muslim population. It should be an absolute giant, a leader in the global halal market. They've even been working hard to certify more products. And yet, when you look at how they're actually doing on the world stage, the story is different. Check out this number. Despite all that potential, Indonesia actually saw the value of its halal exports go down in 2023. What does that tell us? Well, it points to just how fierce the global competition is, and it highlights all those systemic problems we've been talking about. It proves that just having the customers isn't enough if the system itself is full of hurdles. And this really hits the nail on the head. There's this quote from an analysis that says it perfectly. As halal certification expands beyond just food, and as Muslim consumers become more aware, we need a better understanding of it all. To put it simply, as the idea of halal gets bigger and bigger, the need for clear, simple, unified rules becomes more urgent than ever. So that leaves us with one last, really big question. Our world is just getting more complex, more connected every single day. So can a standard like halal, which has roots in ancient tradition, actually keep up? Can it adapt and unify enough to work in our modern global economy? That, right there, is the heart of the global halal challenge.